Until the last 2 decades, the South Boston Seaport District was an underused waterfront where economic decay was compounded by harbor pollution. Thanks in part to public investment in the harbor cleanup and approvals by public agencies, the area has come alive with new housing, hotels, and jobs. But a new survey for the Conservation Law Foundation by the MassSync polling group shows some problems with public access. To tell us about the survey is the foundation's Director of Environmental Planning, Deanna Moran. Thank you very much for being with us, Deanna.
Thanks for having me.
Deanna, most of us go to the Seaport District. We see lots of private investment with all these buildings, but explain, what does the public investment and public access mean?
Yeah, so there's kind of two important pieces here. One, a lot of people know this, but the Boston Harbor cleanup was a massive effort that was undertaken about 30 years ago now. Billions of taxpayer dollars went into that cleanup, in part because of a lawsuit that CLF actually filed. And the result of that investment was the booming economic development that we have down there now. Prior to the cleanup, property values were next to nothing. There wasn't a lot of development interest on the waterfront. And now the Seaport's probably the best example of going from desolate parking lots to, commercial, residential, and various types of development. The other factor here is in Massachusetts, we have a really unique regulatory framework where the public actually has legal entitlements to the waterfront. So there's an area in Massachusetts that's referred to as tidelands. It's really the intertidal area between the historic high and low water marks. And in Massachusetts, those are held in trust by the state for everyone's use. So when a developer in an area like the Seaport acquires a property, they don't own that property in fee simple like they would elsewhere in the city. They essentially have a permanent public easement on that property that requires them to provide public access. So some of the reason that you have all these properties in the Seaport that have public spaces and various amenities is because they're legally required to. And very few people actually know that they are entitled to access those amenities.
Now, so far, my impressions about public access have mainly been about the Harbor Walk. It is growing. Sometimes there are barriers because of construction. But how much access does that provide? I mean, how much of the bigger picture is that?
So any property that's developed under the regulations is required to set aside 50% of the property for public open space. Now that varies a little bit depending on where you are in the state. In the city of Boston, they've used a tool called the Municipal Harbor Planning Process to tweak that a little bit. The idea is that if you were to spread out all of those benefits over a net area, you could do a little bit more local planning by, say having 80% open space here and less over here so that you can accommodate higher density and things like that. And the entire Seaport area was subject to that type of planning process. So in the net, there's about 50% open space in that area that is open and accessible to the public.
What about public attitudes? Because a lot of the survey was about that. Well, what did you find?
So we found, generally people associate the Boston waterfront with the Seaport. Our survey was actually about the Boston waterfront generally, which we consider to be East Boston, Charlestown, downtown. And when we asked open-ended questions about, what people thought of when they thought of the waterfront, many people associate it with the Seaport exclusively. And we found that while overall there were a lot of positive attitudes about the waterfront, there were disparities based on age, income, and race. And in particular that, Black and Hispanic residents are 4 times more likely to feel unwelcome on the waterfront than white residents are.
Well, when I go to the waterfront, I can see how maybe someone might say this confirms the notion that Boston's a racially divided city. But if I go to another part of South Boston, like Castle Island, it's a very diverse city. So, I mean, how do you account for that?
I think there are a number of factors based on the planning of the Seaport, kind of the implementation of those plans, the development. I don't think that any one actor is to blame. I think it's kind of a confluence of different things coming together. Part of it is that in Castle Island, which is a DCR property, it's very clearly a public space. The signage is there to indicate to people that it's free and available to them, that it's state-owned and operated, and just culturally people know that and they associate it with that and they've used it for generations. Versus the Seaport, where a lot of those public spaces, although they are public, they're privately owned. The signage is not as good. They look much more exclusive. There's not as much advertisement. And because that whole area is new, there's not kind of that cultural association with those spaces as being public.
And if you want something to eat, there's no Sullivan's in the Seaport District.
Exactly. Yeah. Our survey actually found that one of the biggest obstacles to people enjoying the Seaport is the cost of getting food, getting drink, that affordability is a huge issue. And next to that, the next biggest issue is public transportation. It's almost completely inaccessible. It's extremely hard to get to, whether you drive or you take public transportation.
What about some examples of some of the spaces where the owners are putting up some kind of obstacles to access, and they shouldn't? What do you have in mind?
Yeah, so one of the best examples of this is actually not in the Seaport, it's in downtown, where the Intercontinental Hotel, that lawn that they have in the back of the hotel, that's one of these spaces that we're talking about that's open and available to the public. And for decades, the Intercontinental, in violation of state regulations, put up a bar. They charged people to use that space when they weren't allowed to. There's a condo association actually above the hotel, and they for a long time had put a sign actually on one of the lawns that said that it was for the exclusive use of the condo association, when that wasn't true. So it's things like that, small things, signage, barriers with pots and plants and things like that, that signal to people that that's an exclusive private property that's not available to them. In the Seaport, it's sometimes less obvious. We haven't seen as many instances of kind of blatant signage telling people they're prohibited from use or anything like that. But what we find more often is that a lot of those spaces are very sterile looking. They're not activated. There's no games on the lawn. There's no seating. And so people are not expressly being told they can't use it, but that's, the signal that they're getting when they walk by is that that's exclusive private property.
On a big scale, I'm going to make one more contrast with Castle Island, is that when you're approaching that location, you're near the water. In a lot of the Seaport District, a lot of the time, it's almost like you don't realize you're near water. Isn't that a design problem that should have been foreseen?
Yeah, I think part of the issue with the Seaport is that it was built out over about 10 years, but in the grand scheme of things, that's very quick. And there was some planning effort that went in at the front end, but when things are built out slowly like that over time, pursuant to a master plan, things change. Developers go back into the city to get things re-permitted, and you kind of start to lose that comprehensive vision that you had at the beginning as small things get tweaked. And so we've seen buildings that were supposed to be commercial turned into residential, areas that were supposed to not be developed. And so the original kind of concept for, well, here are where the view sheds will be, and here's where the public space will interact with the water. A lot of that gets lost over time.
This is Deanna News. We're talking with Deanna Moran from the Conservation Law Foundation. The survey did find this racial divide in how likely people were to feel unwelcome in the Seaport District. What does the foundation want to do about that?
So, we think there are a number of things that can be done and should be fixed, both process-wise and kind of in activating these spaces. The Globe Spotlight series this year showed us that a lot of Black residents actually don't live or work in the Seaport. That's a more systemic issue that we need to deal with. But one of the things that we can do immediately is, although the Seaport is widely built out, there's still development happening. And so to the extent that there are plans still being approved, there are concepts still being designed, there needs to be more diversity at that decision-making table, because it's only when you get everyone in the room together sharing their opinion about what a space should look like that you really get that diversity of opinion that we need in the Seaport. On the programming and activation side, the survey came through loud and clear that we need more accessibility. We need better public transportation options. We need alternative transportation options. We need subsidized parking for those who want to drive and can't afford to park in the Seaport. Although we want to discourage people from parking as much as we can. We need affordable food and drink options. Affordability is a huge barrier right now. And then above all else, we just need more active programming. We need culturally inclusive programming, things for everyone to do, things for families to do, things for young adults to do, older adults to do. and signage and advertisement. Like I said, a lot of people don't know that these spaces are available to them. They don't know that there's free events on the waterfront. They don't know that there's discounts at museums and some of these civic institutions in the waterfront. So really just more awareness of all of those opportunities would help.
Well, when I walk by some establishments there, I would look through the windows, and it would look, the opposite of diversity. But in some of the public access areas, it was at least a little bit of a different story.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we did find in the survey is that people, much more so than we thought, do know that they are actually entitled to some of these spaces. There was some kind of awareness and knowledge about their legal rights to these spaces, although we found a little bit of disparity in that based on income and race. But I think one of the more interesting things that we found in the survey is that residents from other areas of the city were actually more likely to use the museums and some of the cultural amenities on the waterfront rather than the free amenities like the Harbor Walk and like the parks. And we feel that might be, this kind of neighborhood amenity concept where, because a lot of Black and Hispanic residents don't live in the Seaport, they see those kind of free amenities as that neighborhood's amenities. It's their backyard. It's not their, that they have their own neighborhood amenities. And that's kind of the dynamic that we really want to shift, is that the Harbor Walk and the parks in the Seaport are not just for the exclusive use of the people who live and work there. They're for everyone in the state to enjoy. And we'd like to kind of change that mindset of people.
I'd like to focus on one feature of the public access that I discovered last year and really liked. There's that stairway that goes up, and you have that wonderful backdrop. Describe how people have been using that.
Yeah, so it's the Lookout platform at Fan Pier, which is a really, really great free amenity. We've seen people, go on the steps and eat their lunch there. A lot of people would go up there to take pictures. It has an amazing view of the harbor. And it's all around been a great amenity, in part because it's very clear that it's public. And there's signage to that effect. And so it's been really well utilized. And there's also a little cafe actually underneath it where you can go in and kind of grab a sandwich and eat your lunch up on the stairs afterward.
Now, there's also a public green near the waterfront, and you had an event there recently. How was that?
It was great, yeah. So CLF does an annual Pitch a Blanket Day, and we've done it for the past 3 years. This was the third annual event. And we pick up a public space on the waterfront and encourage everybody to come out, bring a blanket, bring a picnic, and just use the space, actively use the space. And this year, because we had just done the survey, we were armed with all of this information. And so one of our priorities was to make sure that we had residents from other areas of the city, other neighborhoods, that were invited and were able to get down here and enjoy the event. And so we, arranged transportation for folks from East Boston and from Dorchester to make sure that we had, a wide variety of residents at the event. And it was great. A lot of people who came had never been to the Seaport before. A lot of the people there didn't know that the particular space we were at, the public green, it's a lawn, that it was free and available to them. And a lot of them said, if it was easier for me to get down here, I would love to bring my kids down here and have them play here, because it's such a great amenity.
There's one other issue you picked up in this survey that surprised me at least a little bit. And I think if I remember correctly, it seemed that the people who were surveyed were more worried, more likely to see development as a threat than climate change with all those rising sea levels. I mean, did that surprise you?
It definitely surprised us. I think that in the way that we asked the question is we asked them to kind of choose the two biggest threats to the waterfront. And you're right, far fewer respondents said that climate change was on the top of their list. And I think for us, there's obviously been a lot of other polling. Residents in Massachusetts and in many areas across the country realize that climate change is here, it's happening, it's urgent. And I think in this context, it really just kind of shows the urgency of these other issues that are at play: displacement, gentrification. Those are things that people are really resonating with and dealing with in their day-to-day life. So I think that really rose to the top for them, especially in the context of kind of the other questions in the survey and the waterfront generally. But for us, it's an opportunity. We need to really, step up our messaging and our awareness around climate change. And in particular, we want people to understand that climate change and public access are actually inextricably linked, because as we see more flooding, as we see these climate impacts, all of these spaces that people have the ability to access now are under threat. CLF actually put out a report a few months ago, and we found that over 1 million square feet of public space in the Seaport and elsewhere in the city will be underwater over the next 30 to 50 years if we don't do anything about it now. So that, I think, is important to making sure that people are able to make that connection.
Thank you very much. Before we go, Deanna, if people want to see this report and read it in full, you've got a website with that, right?
Yes, we do. You should go to www.clf.org.
Thank you very much. Deanna Moran from the Conservation Law Foundation. We'll have more news in just a moment.